All right, I'm recording. We'll see if this works. I just did the whole color wheel thing and I lost my connection. Had that whole wheel spinning the whole time. I don't know. I might still get a link to it and maybe it'll be better than this one. But as I say, this is the first part of my multi-part demonstration. And like most times, I'm starting my demonstration by just talking and looking at a couple of things. But over to the side here, I have put some light washes of color down on a masonite board that's been gessoed, much like yours, and that's allowing it to dry so that I can show you how I intend you to try and use your acrylic paints in this texture grid painting and in other instances. I should note that you do want to make sure that you're using your acrylic paints, not watercolors, because what this relies on is thinning down your acrylics to a very transparent consistency, very thin and watery, and using many layers, many layers. We'll see how many you use, but nonetheless, and layering one over the other. Now, sometimes you can get into some wet and wet, and that works. We'll talk about it when I do that part of the demonstration. But in a lot of cases, the dogs again, in a lot of cases, you're going to be, in a lot of cases, you're going to be having to wait for it to dry and then doing another layer on top and modulating it like that. The objective is basically that you're using transparent layers of color and it's mixing optically. And by that, I mean that you're modulating the color and you're seeing all the different layers of color and also the white of the background, the gesso. You're never going so opaquely or heavily that you obliterate that white background. And so when the viewer looks at something you've painted, they're seeing through all these layers of paint and the white background is reflecting, up through, and then you just see all this subtle modulation of color, and it gives this sense of life, to even things that aren't realistically painted. It gives you a lively surface that is, engaging because it's got so much modulation going on that it's not just pink or green, this opaque blah of color with maybe a little bit of blending and brushing. So the technique is, as I say, it requires patience, like a lot of things. And, as you saw with my examples, a lot of people get working fairly opaquely, fairly quickly. And, that's, like I say, you have to develop your patience. I'll show you some examples about how you could use it in its best, to its best advantage. But as I say, the point of it is acrylic paints, even when they're watered down quite thinly, once they do dry, and it can take a while, and you might want to get a hair dryer on hand to help speed drying up at various stages. But once they do dry, then you can do another wash of color across, and that wet next layer doesn't mix physically with the pigment below. It just lays over top of it. And then you can do other things like scratching or scraping or sanding it to pull out some of the lower layers or the whites, and then put more washes on top and so forth. So that's the objective, is to work with it's very economical because you use the tiniest dab of paint and then you thin it down, a whole bunch with water. There's other ways of doing it with various kinds of mediums, like acrylic mediums that, will make the paint more transparent, but at the same time, it'll keep more thickness. It's for doing different things. But that's, again, painting is kind of all about just playing with the way that paints and sometimes different paints and different medias mix and work with one another when you work certain ways, and seeing what happens, observing it and trying to control it to some extent. And to achieve what you want to achieve. So this is our test run. And as I say, up till now, you've been doing things probably more opaquely with paints, with the acrylics. So, you know, this is another way of doing it. And like I say, before we get to me demonstrating some of those things, and I'll also be doing a gluing demonstration as well, probably 3 parts to this that I'll put in various modules. But I'm going to share screen again and go to a color wheel. Now, the last time I did that, this is what screwed things up, and for some reason it didn't like the preview. And anyhow, we'll see if it happens again. So share screen, and I'm just going to share my desktop there, share, and minimize that. And I'm going over here to open this color wheel. And I don't need to see myself. I put myself over there. So good. So far, there's no spinny other color wheel that the Mac likes to put up and say, your internet connection is weak. So here we have a color wheel. I chose this one. It's I guess it's Arabic, but I chose it because it was a fairly high resolution and, as opposed to the other ones. But what we see here, of course, are primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. Secondary colors, which are violet, orange, and green. And you know, you can kind of read the way this works off of this. Is it's if you mix blue and red, you get violet. You mix red and yellow, you get orange. You mix green, or sorry, yellow and blue, and you get green. Now we know that those, you know, those colors change a little bit and work a little differently depending on which pigments and how, you know, what blues you have and so on. And certain ones don't mix as nicely. Like, you know, it's hard to get a real nice violet out of the red and the blue that you have. And so sometimes that's where people say, oh, I like violet, I like using it a lot, so I'm going to buy a tube of violet, because I can't mix a good violet from these two for anything, but I can mix a pretty decent green. Again, you know, some of you will have more colors, others less, but theoretically you can get everything you need out of these primary colors and maybe a little white and black. So you can mix your orange and you can mix some greens and things like that. So, you know, just a reminder, you did the color wheel and you did your value charts. I won't talk about value, but obviously value intensity plays a part. Like different colors on the color wheel are lighter and different ones are darker in terms of value intensity. If I were to desaturate this and we look at this wheel, you know, you'd see that this is darker and this is lighter, right? So that plays a part, but for the, you know, to try and keep things from getting out of hand here, you know, I'll leave the rest of that to Joanna, and she's talking about the wheel at various points in time. But what I wanted to point out to you is something that you will probably find very useful in your color mixing here. And now I'm going back to physical color mixing, as I call it, where you're taking pigments of paint, right? You're taking blue paint and yellow paint and mixing them together to create a green paint. That's what I call physical mixing. What we're going to be doing, though, is you'll be doing some physical mixing to make colors. But when you start applying it onto the board that I'll be demonstrating later, when you're using those washes, you're using optical mixing, because what you're going to be doing, as I say, is you put a layer of a color, very thin and transparent, so the white is still active in the background, and then you see the color, and then once it dries, or sometimes you'll actually mix it in, but if you mix wet into wet, if I take a red and then I take some yellow and I run the yellow into it while it's still wet, it's going to bleed together and actually physically mix. And you may get some separations where it's a little more yellow and a little more red, or it just may flow all together and create a sort of orange middle ground. You're never sure. It depends on how much water and that kind of thing. That's physically mixing on the board. But that's where, as I say, what you want to do here is when you're doing this, in many cases, you're going to be making sure that that one layer is fully dry, and then you you paint the other thin layer on top, and it just sits on the surface, so it doesn't disturb the pigment below and mix together. It just lays on top of it. And then you can modulate that second layer and have a little more intensity here, a little less there. You can maybe, wad up a piece of Kleenex and blot up a bit so that it takes on a bit of a pattern. Or once it's dry, you can scrape a little bit off or lightly sand the surface to bring some of the white tops into play, and then put another transparent layer, and then put another, and then another, and then another, and then another. Anyways, we'll get back to that. But for these layers of color, while as I say, you may mix yourself a few greens. You might have a green and a bit of a blue green and a bit of a yellow green. Say, I need a few greens here. I'm going to add a little white to this one to lighten it up, because I'm doing some foliage like texture, and there's a whole variety and range of greens. But basically, if you're mixing yellow and blue together, the green you're going to get is still going to be pretty intense, right? It's going to be more yellowy green or more bluish green, but it's still going to be fairly pure hued, right? Because you're using these two intense colors. Now, a lot of times people that want to soften that, bring down that color intensity, will add a little black to try and darken it so that they can say, oh, that's more shadowy, or they'll add a little white to brighten it up and say, well, I can use that as the lighter tops here of the light on the tops of the leaves or whatever. I won't say don't use white and black, but when I was in painting class, they sort of said, don't use that, don't do that at all. Just stay away from it, because we want you to learn how to intermix your primaries to modify the intensity. So that's what I'm going to jump to. I won't talk about any other color arrangements. I will talk about mixing complementary. Did I say primaries? I meant mixing complements. Mixing primaries creates your secondaries, tertiaries, and so on. Mixing complements together creates, modifies the intensity of the hue, the chromatic intensity. And it's the best way, without going out and buying all kinds of other tubes of paint, to make your earth tones, that makes it simple, what we call earth tones. If you've been in the store, if you like to do nature scenes and that, you've probably gone in there and say, ooh, look at that, burnt umber and burnt sienna and yellow ochre and sap green and all of these tube colors that are earthy, what we would call earthy colors. But you can mix those, as we say, pretty much from your primaries. But again, if you're going to mix complements, you're going to end up having to mix some of your secondaries at least, unless you happen to have a set of colors where you've got primaries and secondaries. So if you have the orange, violet, green, red, yellow, blue, well, you're all kind of set. But if not, you might have to mix one. Like you might have to mix your blue and your yellow together to get a green. And maybe while you're doing it, you'll kind of make a little more yellow in one and have it more of a yellow green, and a little more blue and have a blue green and then a green. And then you'll have 3 different greens to play with. But at some point, and as I say, you can kind of move between them. Again, complements are colors that are directly across from one another on a color wheel. So you can kind of go anywhere and say yellow, violet, blue and orange, whatever, red, orange, and blue, green. Any of those are complements. But I'm going to go with just red and green, because one thing about them is theoretically red and green are the same value. Again, that changes depending on the tube of paint you've got, but they're roughly the same, around a 5 or 6, around the middle of a 9 value color chart. One other thing I should mention while I remember, and this is maybe not as noticeable in washes as it is when you're using paint more thickly, but Joanna may have mentioned it, is most of the time acrylic paints will dry slightly darker than what they look like when they're wet and you're mixing them. So when you're mixing that color and you brush some out to look at it, you usually have to wait until it dries to see what the real value is. It's going to dry about a half a value darker on the 9-tone value chart. So, that's just something to consider. Acrylic paints dry a little bit darker. I guess, oil paints too, maybe, but paints, generally acrylic, dry a little darker once they're dry than when they're wet and in your mixing pot, so to speak. So keep that in mind when you're considering your color mixing. But what I want you to cover is in the physical intermixing of colors. If you mix complements, and as I say, red and green are theoretically the same value, so they don't darken or lighten one another too much. Whereas if you're getting into yellow and violet, well, mixing a bit of violet into yellow is going to darken it a lot, as well as muddy it up fairly quickly. So red and green are kind of good ones to work with, because again, greens, we find a lot of greens in nature, and although we do find some reds in nature, again, a lot of the reds are earthier, right? As are some of the greens. And that's where it's in the spectrum between the two, as you mix them together, that you find all of those nice earth tones that you might be using for bark or leaves and so forth. Because basically, if I take a red and mix a little bit of green into it, just the tiniest bit, and do everything small amounts at a time. When you're thinning paint, add a few drops of water, stir it and mix it, add a few more drops, stir it and mix it. I'll show you that in a bit. But if you just, take a big blob of paint and stick it in there and then pour a bunch of water in, then you're chopping it up and there's chunks and blah, blah, so do things in measured amounts, right? And pace it. So the same thing when you're mixing colors, don't add a whole bunch, add a little bit at a time and see how it changes, then add a little more. You can always add a little more as you are moving along, but if you put too much, it's hard to back it up, right? So anyhow, so for those earth tones, as I say, just mix complements together. So in the case of red and green, add a tiny touch of green to the red, and you're going to see it start to, basically what they're doing is they say it's graying either color out. Whichever you mix into the other, it starts to do what they call graying it out. That's a theoretical term, graying. What it does is brown it out. It creates a middle brown. Somewhere between these two, you'll reach a middle point where it's not really reddish brown and it's not really greenish brown, it's just brown, right? But anything on either side between, here and here, if I'm just going along, I'm using it as a value chart as well, but in any case, it's going to be brownish red or reddish brown, whatever you want to call it. And on this side of it, it's going to be a brownish green. And so this is where you find your olive greens and so forth. And up in this range, as there's more red, that's where you find your burnt siennas and so forth. So if you add a little bit of green, it's going to lower the intensity of the red and make it just a little bit of a reddish brown. A little more green becomes a little more reddish brown, just a little bit at a time, and then you'll find that that's where you're getting those earth tones. And as I say, on the other side, mix a little bit of red into the green, and that's where you get your olive green and so forth. So if there's any color, of the other colors on the wheel, and you say, okay, violet, that's a sort of violet, this thing I want, but it's too intense, it's too bright and purpley purple and pure. I want it to be a softer, an earthier violet. Well, put a little bit of yellow in there. Add a little bit of yellow, not too much, just a bit at a time, stir it up, and it's gonna take out some of that intensity, color intensity, because it's lowering the chromatic intensity is what it's called, by mixing complements. And once again, complements are colors directly across from one another on the color wheel. Boom, 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 boom. All right, well, so far it seems I'm still recording and I haven't crashed the computer or anything. I shouldn't do this at night because something about Wi-Fi signals in the house seems to get funny at night. So I'm going to stop the share, or perhaps not. Okay, I'm opening Safari, and I'm going to close that again and open it one more time here. I want to go to my Cambrian. So since I'm what I want to go here now is to show you a few examples of how I used washes, and I use it a lot, but a little more intensely, let's say, these days. And so I'm going to go back to a really old piece. So I'm going to my website, which I can get to, and this is for your reference as much as anything. The reason I'm going this way is if we go in, and it it doesn't really matter which one we choose. we'll go into Fine Art Studio since that's sort of the class I'm doing it for. When we go into faculty information, there's me, hi, blah, blah, blah. What that, oh, YouTube. No, there it is. There's my website. So there's supposed to be an image load here, but it's always so slow, it'll probably crash my computer. I'm waiting to see, but, oh, there it is. All right, okay. So if you get to the website, this could get me talking about graphic designers. I had Sean from Graphic Design do this lovely website for me. And, you know, basically when you open it, it runs sort of loop of video. And to get in, you got to click on that and then it'll go to there. Now, we had a long discussion about this. This is the mixed media page. Now, most of my work is mixed media, so it's all in here and you can go la-di-da-da-da-da-da, look at stuff. But in any case, the point was, is he, you know, I got that, like that plus sign or whatever you like. And the thing you liked is click, ooh, it turns into an X. And there is the menu, if you will. But we land on a page of many. And we argued, and I said, half the people that go to my website, Sean, they land on this page, they see a bunch of stuff, and then that's what they think it is you just scroll and there's the stuff. That's it. That's all there is to it. Look at that. All the years. You can go to the years. You can say, well, what went on here in 2011? Or what went on here in 2003? Anyhow, but that's just the mixed media page. You can go here and then there's photos, prints, sculpture, tunnel. Tunnel, I'll direct you to probably at some point in time because it's like a process book. So when I'm talking about the process book, I'm going to go pay a visit to Tunnel. And there's my bio. I went long because they say, don't go long. It should be like 100 words. I'm like, forget it. I said, if you just want 100 words, read the first 100 words and then go away. It's like this thing. It's, oh, you can't write anything because people just don't understand. I'm like, too bad then. I guess they'll just have to continue not understanding. But where I'm going is sculpture. So I'm going to scroll way down here through the sculptures. I haven't done a lot of sculpture in years. There's some constructions. So when we're talking found object constructions that you'll be doing for other things, these are a few things I did for the fun of it. And they're somewhere now. And then there's some other sculptures in polyester resins. But I'm going way back to when I was a student. Way back. Oh, I did this Holy Redeemer sculpture in 1996. There I am with a big Jesus. Now I did use some wash techniques for painting it. There you could see. So a little bit, you know, because they wanted it flesh tone. There's no hair. In any case, but I'm not going to that one. I'm going even further back. There is some, this does also involve use of washes of color, fairly lightly used on a sculptural piece. But no, I'm still going back. There we are. So I did this series of sculptures, and there's an installation view. So there's 3 of them. They're all from the same mold. I've actually got the mold at school still, and some of the test plaster pieces. These are in epoxy resin. That doesn't matter too much, but they've been painted in the technique that I'm going to show you on the board. So basically, you know, all of this blues through the yellows, you know, the flesh tones in here, and we'll get some close-ups. All of that's been painted with very thin washes of color. And I kept a record of those washes. I've got a couple books somewhere that cover the whole process. And I think that there's 70 layers of color on here. But with all of those 70 washes, as I say, as thin as tea, as weak tea, that each one just slightly modulating this way, that way, you know, maybe I got a bit excessive. I don't expect you're going to be doing 70 washes. But how many washes, you would say? How many washes do I need to do for this birch bark? You might get away with 5 or 6 or 8. You know, another bark might take a few more, and then you might get a little more opaque and so on, but you'll see as you go. You just, as with a lot of these things, you just have to start doing it and experience it, right? But as I say, just in terms of time and so forth, I did this as a student. I started it in 2nd year, or no, I started in, I can't even remember. 3rd year, I guess, because it was 2nd year. You didn't take sculpture until you were in 2nd year. And so I spent my first year in sculpture, which was my second year of college, doing stuff, one that ultimately I didn't follow through on. And then I started this one. And basically I spent the whole school year, 2 semesters, to go through with this. It only took me about 2 weeks to do the original clay sculpture piece, but then I learned how to, make rubber molds. And so all of these are cast from the original molds that were made from a clay piece. So I made one clay piece and then cast them into epoxy resin, painted them, built sculpture bases, and so forth. So overall, I believe there was about 450 hours of work to complete these. I could look in my book. Maybe it was more. Maybe it was 600. I don't know. In any case, so as I say, these are sort of show the best use of transparent washes, as I say, on a three-dimensional piece in this case, very delicately used so that the white of the epoxy resin is still active in what we're seeing. So here we see a fetal child, and again, it's been painted with many different layers of light red, a little bit of yellow, a tiny wash of slate green across the top here, a little bit of sanding here and there. And as you can see, as I built it up here and there, I'll put little bits of violet to create veins in the head, little bits of red. Overall, it's a sort of fleshy pink. But as I say, what you're seeing here is the result of maybe 30 or 40 layers of color, but all as thin and transparent as twice as transparent as what I'll demonstrate with you, because as I say, if I go with the transparency I went with here, you put a layer on, it dries, you hardly notice any difference, but you just keep doing it and slowly you modulate, so that the cheek, there's a bit more of the yellows into the oranges, and then then down into here and so forth. So as I say, this kind of shows where, it's not, spray paint the head pink, paint some veins on. It's slowly build up those layers of color so that when you look at it, it's constantly changing. And that's basically how, the reason that gives this lifelike quality, as we would say, to a surface, whether it's a realistic rendering of anything or not, is because when we see things in life, they are not static like artwork is sometimes. They're constantly changing. When you look at someone, they're moving subtly, they're talking, they turn their head, the light that's lighting them is changing. So when we see people and things and even trees and grasses and that in real life, they're constantly shifting and changing, and the light is changing, and they're never one fixed thing. When we do a painting, suddenly we make something and it tends to be fixed, and it's like that, and it doesn't change, right? When you look at it. So this idea of using washes like this is that, as the viewer looks at it, their eye is constantly looking and compensating and seeing the shifts and changes, and it makes their eye mimic the way they see living things, moving things, that things that are being seen in time, right? Where the light is changing and all of that. So that's my best explanation for that. So here, basically, I just put two of the bottoms of that cast together to create an interesting yin yang kind of thing. And then, you have the two fetal forms hanging one over top of the other, and I call this still life, still birth. And then again, this one is painted somewhat more pinkly like the first one, whereas this one is a little more grayish and, and then noble jellyfish. So again, the same, there's a lid, like basically, if you see the first one here, this was the cast. So I made this bottom part in clay, and I made the top part in clay, and then I did a two-piece mold of each of those parts, and then they were put together like this. And as I say, then the second one was two bottoms that were cast and put together, and then the third one was just another like the first, although it was mounted so that it was closed down and you could hardly see the fetus inside. You had to kind of peek inside. And then the outside is more of a violet as opposed to the greenish of the first one. And there's some other stuff. I used similar techniques on these whales that I did for Science North some years ago. Again, they got a little more opaque as it went, but this was the fin whale, and it's a greenish gray kind of thing like whales are. But if you were to get close in this, you would see that again, it's composed of many different washes, slowly built up transparently, and so it modulates and has a little more lifelike, quality. There's a sperm whale before it was painted. These are all scale. So this guy's about 5 feet long. This guy's a little smaller. This one's tiny. He was the smallest. The narwhal was only about a foot long for the main part of the body, and then he's got his little narwhal tusk. Killer whale is about 1.5 feet, 20 inches long. So killer whale is quite small compared to the fin whale and so forth. And then again, these are just done in plaster. I did this when I was between second and third year as a student. So summer 1985 or 86. Oh, there's the beluga unpainted. This is the bowhead before paint. And this is the humpback. He's kind of in progress. So you can see I'm still painting it. You can see how it kind of modulates. And again, it's a greenish gray that, you can start, as I'm building it up, you're getting some of the scarring and modulation that you see in the surface, rather than like spray painting it like garage floor gray and saying, there's a whale, just done, oh, and there I am doing some plaster work summer, many moons ago. So that's the sculpture section there. But as I say, this is probably the best example of using washes on those sculptural pieces there. If you go through mixed media, you may find some things, but I have this, a much more intense way of using color now, so it's not as transparently used, but again, I'll just do a quick scroll to see if there's anything relevant in that front, but not really. It's mostly a little more opaque. But again, not entirely. There's always, again, all, transparencies, bleeds, and so forth with these. There's still active, the white of the canvas is still active here. You can see how the reds modulate and so on and so forth. So, but those colors are still pretty intense compared to what we'll be looking at for some of the things. So yeah. Anyhow, that's enough of that. As I say, you can check out the website if you want at any point in time, and I will direct you there at some point to discuss the process book. So with that, I hear my computer making that huffing puffing sound that it does when it's working hard, and I'll probably not test my luck by going on any further. That was the part that I wanted to cover before I go to the actual demonstrations over here. And I'm going to do those with my phone. I think I'm going to still work on that tonight. So we'll see. I'll get my lights on. I'll see what I've got over there. And then, as I say, I'm going to do just a quick demonstration with how to apply the color, a bit of talk about that. And then I'll also cover the wet gluing technique in another separate little segment. So this will probably be up on the website, or whatever you call it, up in Moodle as preliminary color demonstration, color mixing, something like that. But again, that's important to note is, right, what are we doing with these colors? I'm saying here, thin it down and brush it on and so on, but what colors are you using? How are you, how are you deciding what's the order of business? And as I said, what you're going to be doing is with these layers, it's optical mixing, is that you're letting layers dry and then putting colors on top and basically thinking of how colors mix. So you're saying, I want that red to be a little less intense. I want it to be a bit more of an earthy red. So I'm going to take the faintest little wash of green and run that across it and see where that moves it and let it dry. And then say, okay, and now I'm going to, you know, a touch of yellow to brighten this up, you know, this end of it up. And, you know, and maybe a little bit more green on this end so that it starts to get a bit more of an earthy, slightly, you know, brownish tone. And that way, you know, you're starting to shift and modulate. Because if you look at anything, as I say, we might think of it as having a dominant color. One of the first things we had to do as students was to come in and they said, bring a green pepper to school and you're going to sit and draw that. And, you know, we want you to use like every color you got. Look at that thing and see, you know, how even though it's green for the most part, look at the subtle shifts of yellows, of reds, of violets, and build it up and do washes like that to create this green pepper. And they didn't say, don't use any green, but they said, don't rely on just your green to paint this thing. You know, really work your color scheme. So again, hey, maybe that's an exercise. If you want to do that, you know, warming up, grab a green pepper and really look at that thing and sort of try some washes, try to paint that, just do a little painting of green pepper to test your washes and you know, try it out. One of the things we had to do a lot of, and we hated as students, but we had to do it, swatches, color swatches. We used to, you know, that's something that you may do for this. Swatches are just, you know, little sections of color on a piece of paper where you're just testing what you're going to do. You really shouldn't ever be just jumping in and starting painting it right on the actual final piece until you've tested a few things out. See how it's going to work. See if it's too strong, right? Everybody kind of wants to jump the gun and just go and get her done. There's no surer way to screw things up than just jump in and think you're going to manage it, because you're probably not. Test it out. Takes time, but time is what it takes. So, you know, there you go. That makes me think of Joanna's 10,000 hours to be a professional thing. You know, sometimes, you know, people think we overwork them, and we say, well, you know, if you're not spending 40 or 50 hours a week on your homework and schoolwork, you know, how much time do you think you got to do this, right? How long do you think you got? As Joanna likes to point out, she says that in general, like airline pilots, plumbers, this, that, the other thing, there's a sort of general rule of thumb that 10,000 hours of practice of working, you know, for 10,000 hours on learning and doing that thing is the threshold for saying, there, that person's now a professional. They've spent 10,000 hours. What's 10,000 hours? If you work 50 hours a week working on art, 50 hours a week, every week for 50 weeks of the year, I'll give you 2 weeks off. 2 weeks you get off. You can take Christmas season off, and a week there and a week in the summer, whatever. The rest of the 50 weeks of the year, you're working 50 hours a week. That's 10 hours a day, and you got your weekends off, however you want to organize it, call it 50 hours. You say, that's a lot. That means 4 years it takes you to reach 10,000 hours. 4 years, well, you say, well, a lot of programs and school things are, you know, 4 years. Yeah, but that's not 4 years, 50 weeks of the year. So whatever. But then, you know, you say 50 hours, that's ridiculous. So, you know, 25 hours a week, 25 hours a week is more than enough. Well, then that's 8 years, right? Have you got 10 hours a week to spend on learning the arts and doing things? 10 hours, there you go, 25 years. Take you 25 years to reach 10,000 hours. So you got 25 years to learn to do what you want to do. Anyways, I just could put it in there. I know people get stressed out. There's a lot of work, but that's the way it is. And the trends these days, they say, oh, design programs, they just drive people, and they say you should just work your life away. But that's the thing that we don't realize as artists sometimes is we admire art, we look at art, and we say, that's beautiful art, I love it, I love that, I'd love to do that. And we don't really realize that the piece that we're looking at might have taken 100 hours for a person to paint, but never mind that 100 hours, they probably spent 10,000 hours leading up to that, just to get good enough to be able to do that thing in 100 hours. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, as I said, it's, you know, this process is 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration. So spending time working on things daily is kind of what you got to do. Work on it every day. Keep working, work. Practice, practice, practice. Draw, draw, draw. Do swatches. Do tests. You know, engage yourself with the boring parts. With this, you know, it's like, oh God, I don't want to test that out. I found, you know, there's many times where I will spend, let's say, 2 hours mixing and testing colors, mixing, doing swatches, testing, adjusting, trying this out, doing that, you know, mixing up maybe say 10 or 15 colors that I'm going to apply to a certain area. And then, you know, I've got it laid out. I know what I want to do, and I start and I'm done in 10 minutes, right? But to get, you know, there and get that done, that 10 minutes of work, you know, takes a few hours just to get everything mixed and adjusted and tested. And as I say, we don't see that. We sort of see the, you want to go there, do it. Yeah, there's certain things that go very quickly, but they only go quickly because you've prepared and spent all this time sort of getting some things done. So, you know, develop your patience, and we'll try and develop your patience a little bit with the texture grid. So when I next see you, the video that I will direct you to will be stage 2, which is wash demonstration. I'll see you there.